Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love. My co-host Wilfred Riley is working on internet and will hopefully be here shortly. But I didn't want to wait and hold up our wonderful guest this week. Our guest is John Hughes. He's a West Point grad, top of his class, combat veteran, emergency room doctor, and author of the new book, American Doctor, Coming Home to War. Here's the book. Let me get the glare off. There you go, American Doctor, Coming Home to War. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's an honor to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. One of the friends of the show told us about the book, and as I do with our guests, I respect their hard work as an author myself. That's my book right there. I read the book. I thought it was interesting, and I thought by getting the idea of what it was about, reading the cover. And it is a bit about that, but you read the cover and I'm thinking, okay, it's about a guy who was in the military. He put his life on the line for the country and he came home to this madness. And so he wanted to talk about the madness he came home to. And it's not that you don't talk about that, but I found it fascinating because it's kind of a biography of someone who's a contemporary. We're around the same age. And you're walking through your time in the military, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's very honest, so people will enjoy that. So I figured I'd spend the first half of the interview actually talking about that. And so I don't know if that was your intent. You can talk about that from the book. I guess we start there. What made you write the book? And was the book intended initially to be what I thought it was about, and primarily about the coming home to war part? Or were you, attentively and deliberately trying to write about kind of shed a light on the military as well, because you did a lot of that. What was the intent going into writing the book?
The intent of my book is I lived within two worlds for a long time. I was in the military for quite some time until about 9 years ago. And then I was, of course, in the medical field as well since about 2002. And so it occupied most of my life. And obviously there's the good and bad and all the specialties. And when I deployed overseas and when I was in the military back home again, there were some things I liked, a lot of things I didn't like, but I kept a diary of it. And then there were a lot of things about the war, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, that unfolded, as you saw in the book, that made the ultimate outcome of it inevitable. Mm-hmm. And I was frustrated, like a bunch of other folks were. There wasn't a heck of a lot I could do about it at the time. So I just wrote in my diary, did my time, did the best I could to save as many lives as I could, and then I stuck my diary on a shelf. And then I was okay when I got out of the Army for a few years. I focused on just emergency medicine, not wearing a uniform anymore. And then August of 2021 happened. My niece was in the Army. She was actually deployed over there when all the mess over in Kabul was going down. And it was just insane what actually happened. But the galvanizing moment was actually a few months after that. I went to my 25th reunion at West Point, and I was watching my peers who were still wearing a uniform. They were 1-star generals now. Now a lot of them were actually 2 and 3 stars, but they were just glossing over the whole piece, saying don't look over here, nothing's broken in the military. And West Point, the duty honor country, where doing your best for your country and in the military and uniform and your word is your bond, that didn't sit well with me, because a lot of the stuff I saw over there was a lot of integrity issues. And a part of what I wrote in the book was to stay in my lane. My father's always clear about that, and he's right. And so I just stayed in my lane of where I was in the provinces where I was and at the times that I was there. And so I kept a diary of what I saw in Iraq 05, 06, and then Afghanistan 7, 8, 9 in 2013, and I kept a diary of what I saw, and then I kept a log, and also in the news of what the generals were saying, how the war was actually going on. And there was a substantial disconnect there In Iraq, it's a little murky because the bad guys obviously didn't win over there, but it's still a mess. If you look, it's still in the terror watch country, and Americans are advised still not to go over there, despite all the billions that were, or even more than that we've spent over there. But Afghanistan obviously is an utter and complete disaster, despite what our general officers, many of them West Pointers, who are supposed to tell their word is supposed to be their bond at all cost, and that was not actually the case. So it caused me to really reflect on what is the state of the military right now when you have 70 to 80% of general officers getting out and working for the big corporations, kind of like in the medical field, and we'll get to that. And they're afraid to speak the untruth. And so the question is why? Um, so that was for about 2/3 of the book, speaking about the military piece. And then I came back and I discussed the culture war, because the culture war kind of brings up the second portion of the book, which was the medical piece. Because in the medical piece, obviously, it's great to be a doctor. It's great to treat patients, but of course, there's a lot of politics in medicine too, of course, and you have money and a lot of influences. But as an ER doctor, just fresh out of the army, I was just keeping my head down. But when COVID hit, a lot of the same issues and thoughts, some of that I had during the war, were beginning to come to light. And then the censorship that came down hard initially on the doctors after COVID came down was just astonishing. And I hadn't initially wanted to include that in the book. It was a little difficult at first, but I wanted to try to connect the dots here to some common ethical themes that we were seeing as a country within our military and then our medical field. I mean, our military hasn't won a war since World War II. Strategic outcome. The Gulf War is a footnote. You can talk about that, but the long-term strategic outcome, though, the military won it, but obviously long term we went back to Iraq and it's a mess over there still. But in terms of the big wars, big long wars, the U.S. military hasn't won one since World War II, which it brings up a lot of bigger questions. But again, just staying in my lane, I was just focusing on Iraq and Afghanistan, and I did touch a little bit about Haiti because I kind of cut my teeth on when I was in the infantry there.
So you describe the book pretty summarize it pretty well there, but you describe it as two sections, the military and then the medical piece and coming home. But I look at it as three. So we get into some details on some of those things, what you saw and what some of the problems were. But I want to start at the beginning. There's another facet. You talk about your time at West Point, how some courses were hard, some were much harder, some things came easy to you, and how you had to keep adjusting with each new challenge. Is it physical? You have to get used to that. Then it's mental, then the medical things and those kind of deal. But then even your family, it's like, you got something else to live up to there. I mean, family fought in every war, every man in your family been in the military, all decorated, from your decorated father to, your paternal grandfather, your maternal and paternal great grandfather. So talk a bit about the family history for you and how the military just runs in your blood.
Well, the legacy I included for two portions of it. Well, three. One is a sense of pride. I mean, a lot of folks have obviously lineages in various occupations, and they have a lot of self pride in that. Number two, just what my motivation was to go into the military in the first place, and it's all I wanted to do. I grew up in a strong military family, but in the context of this book, though, I included that because I wanted folks to see that I had a lot of skin in the game with this, and it was not a very light thing I was doing by criticizing the military and then leaving before retirement. And I wanted folks to see that how much the military actually meant to me, how much it meant to my family. But what I saw in the current trends in the military, I just couldn't do it anymore. So I wanted to make that clear that I had a lot of skin in the game, if you will, with the military.
All right. And the other thing that was funny to me, when you talked about, I laughed when you were talking about your desire to go to medical school and you got to the point where you had to decide whether you want to hold off medical school or go infantry. It talked about, your dad, what you wanted to do, how you saw your service to be and where you thought you would be deployed. It was kind of a no-brainer, even though it's a tough decision, kind of a no-brainer. And I laughed because it made me think at that point, I was like, you remind me of Teddy Roosevelt, right? How Teddy was just like, I mean, his was different, of course, that he had a legacy of family, even some that were Confederates on both sides of the Civil War. But when his dad didn't serve, it became such a big deal to him. That's why he just kept going back, right? He's just like, no, I'm not gonna end up like that. I'm not gonna make that mistake. It made me think of that because you were so adamant about no infantry standing up tall. It has to be infantry. So I thought that was funny. But then also the fact that you decided to study military history. Why military history?
Well, I've always been fascinated by history. When you go to West Point, it's so steeped in a lot of the history of the nation and the military itself. It just seemed like an enjoyable thing. And to be honest, I had a lot more fun than my peers who went with the pre-med route. I knocked out all my pre-med courses in the first 2 years. And then the last 2 years, I spent studying with the focus on actually military history after World War II. And actually, that actually served me well because again, I'm just an amateur historian. I don't have a PhD or anything like that. But it allowed me a little bit, I think, to see just a little bit more into what was actually going on behind the scenes in the war and how it was completely misunderstood who we were actually fighting over there. Like in Afghanistan, if you look back at Afghanistan and you look at Iraq, like I used to joke with the British when I was there. I mean, this is all their fault, especially Afghanistan. The Treaty of Rawalpindi of 1873 when the Russians from the north and the British in the south were trying to protect all their interests. And at all costs, as the Russian Empire was growing, they wanted to keep the Russians out of the lucrative East India Company. So they formed this country. And if you look at Afghanistan, it goes from what used to be Persia, and it has a little nub over on the far right, and it goes all the way to China, and it's no accident. And when they did that, and the same thing in Iraq, it was very ad hoc done without any regard whatsoever for the cultural and the religious implications of those folks who are now trapped within the borders. And as you saw in Iraq, it was sectarian war, even though we weren't allowed to say that, it didn't exist. It was quite obvious that that's what it was, and the same thing in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan was a Pashtun civil war from the Pashtun who were loyal to the government and those who were loyal to the Taliban. And if you don't understand that it was a religious and an ethnic war, then you have no idea what Afghanistan's about. And so America just became one more empire that is in the graveyard of empires. That's another great book for having no understanding whatsoever about what the culture is about over there.
Mhm. And so, like you say, the book does, in large part, walks through your service and your tours and the things that we got, not just the things you got wrong, but you tell the truth about what you saw in operational things, things you challenged, which was interesting. You also challenged authority sometimes. But before you get to Iraq and Afghanistan, you mentioned Haiti. So Haiti was interesting, of course. We're talking the 90s under Clinton. And, it's the mission there, right? So we talk about the mission, especially Afghanistan. Like, what is the mission? If you're at war, you don't have a plan to win, or if you don't have a clear reason why you're there, you're destined to make mistakes, even in addition to the other mistakes you may make. But what was interesting about Haiti, there was a bigger humanitarian piece to that, but there was some hostiles there, and you talked about a combination of this questionable mission, but also the unclear rules of engagement and what to do at different levels of escalation. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, over there I was actually in a very different occupation. I was in the infantry, as you say,
Mhm.
over there. So I was more of the executor of the armed policy. Now I got there after the invasion, about 2 years afterwards. So it wasn't really a shooting war at that point. It was more of a peacekeeping. And as the infantry guys, we were just the guards,
Right.
basically to secure all the humanitarian efforts because Haiti had no real functioning central government there. It was basically a crime-ridden place where the criminal masterminds ran the whole country there. And so we were just there to keep the peace, keep our guys safe while they did various humanitarian projects over there. But I noted it, and I pulled just a few anecdotal pieces out there where we would go down there, and it was a foreshadowing of my time in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they would say, "Hey, we're going to go into a school and renovate a school," and so they got the Secretary of State came down there. We actually got to escort her in there. A very nice woman, Madeleine Albright. Um, but she gave this speech where she talks about all the great things done at the school, and then as soon as she left, we escorted quarterback. She flies away. We took the security down, and then the local crime guys went over and ransacked the whole school. That part didn't make the news, but it was a colossal failure. Unfortunately, it was not a shooting war against our troops, and the only death, I believe, was in the initial invasion. So it didn't cost as much as Iraq and Afghanistan, at least in terms of national treasure and more importantly, lives. But it was an indication of things to come, because I think even there, and I included, for example, General Petraeus, who's not one of my favorite generals. He was actually down there as a major, I believe, and he was writing a lot of these rules of engagement. And in his book, then Paula Broadwell, I think she published that thing in 2012. She has him quoting, it was a great educational period for how foreign policy and nation building should take place. And I reflected on that because in Iraq, I was there in 06. And if you recall, I think there was an earthquake or some huge national disaster there. And I remember the Marines having to go back into the Port-au-Prince airport down in Haiti, right where I was. And they were talking about how it was still a humanitarian disaster there, massive corruption of the government. We took one military corrupt guy out and stuck another corrupt guy in his place, who was then overthrown by another corrupt guy over there. So it was a failed state, but billions of bucks in years later. And so it was interesting to see the guys who cut their teeth in Haiti. Now these guys are in charge, of course, in Iraq and Afghanistan, making the same statements about how the war is going. And you can connect the dots there from the ethics of the military.
Right. Wasn't there, I don't know if it was 80 or not, because you give so much detail, but wasn't there also a scenario, a situation that you mentioned in the book where the US troops like put in a whale or so? Was it a whale? And
Yeah.
you're not even driving completely away. You can still see the whale when the crime lords there just, kind of stand in front and say, okay, now this is going to be the fee to use it, and started charging people to use it.
Yeah, it's just what happens when you have a failed state and no government. It's just mob rule, and the ones in charge of the mob rule. We saw the same thing in Iraq with the wheelchair incident, where we had an American who built these 200 makeshift wheelchairs over there, and we had to get the consent of the Iraqi police chief in order to do it. But we had to pay a tax of about a dozen or so wheelchairs, where we had to give it to him so that he could sell those on the black market. And then he gave his blessing for us to go into the neighborhoods and to pass out the wheelchairs. So it's the bartering system. And I had the one too about the gasoline, right? So the hospital was running out of gasoline. So we weren't supposed to give the Iraqis gasoline directly, because they're supposed to have their own infrastructure. So I convinced my boss, hey, if you want the hospital to keep working, so the Iraqi casualties don't keep coming to our base, but they have to have diesel. And so he authorized 10,000 gallons. And in the juice, you saw each layer of the Iraqi government and military, each person takes their own cut to sell in the black market, and only about 2,000 actually made it to the hospital.
Right. So,
And then you
so
saw the same thing in Afghanistan too, where the generals were saying how great the military was, even in 13 over there, where they had helmets, they had body armor, they had the eye protection. And then I saw the Afghan troops coming in, getting blown up, and they were missing eyes because they didn't have eye protection. They had fragmentary wounds in their skulls because they didn't have helmets. They were getting gunshot wounds in places in their chest where they shouldn't have if they had the body armor on. And I would speak to the advisors over there and say, yeah, if the troops didn't pay a tribute to the general in the Afghan army, he wouldn't pay him, wouldn't give him ammunition or protective equipment over there. And none of that was coming out in the news. The generals were just saying again how great the war is going. And that was 8 years before the epic collapse.
and then the critique that you mentioned, you give some examples. Like you said, you kept a diary, and you also do a good job of laying out all the different facets of it. So from misleading the public, like you talk about, with the higher brass, the generals and other political people would say one thing in the media, and then what was really happening was different. But we'll get to some of those. But the larger question is, what do you think was the motivating factor for many of them? I know some of them may be different, but it could be corruption, it could be incompetence, it could be political, it could be all these things. And usually when you hear about these things, and see, that's the problem. I mean, it's this bad, and the things that you describe, which you can mention some of them. are no doubt problematic. I mean, it could be the nature of the military, right? When you have a chain of command and people are supposed to follow, some people are not built like you to just ruffle feathers and ask questions and push back. And some of the other reasons that we mentioned. The problem is what we constantly hear as civilians, of course, is when something fails, it's almost like we give people too much credit. We act like they're not human, right? They're all these superhumans that are genius. It's always some ill intent. It always some Machiavellian, Mr. Burns from The Simpsons on top, pulling all these strings when sometimes it's just bad decisions or whatever the case may be. So speak to some of these problems you talk about, but in a relation to whether or not it's just incompetence or the other things I mentioned, or is there some deliberate, we're trying to destroy some country, or we're trying to take their oil and that kind of thing. So, how would you place these problems that you noticed when you were there?
I think in terms of our military leadership, I mean, being an infantry officer was actually a blessing in many different ways. One, it was the fun and the adventure, but I got to see too that the leaders of our military, especially in the combat arms, are some of the smartest guys ever. I mean, they can juggle 15 different things in their mind. They're brilliant men. So I don't think it's a competence issue of what's going on. I think um, looking back on it, and I don't think it's a political issues because this spanned multiple presidencies, both Democrat and Republican here. So I don't think it was a case of they were kissing up to one side or the other. I mean, this was a bipartisan military and a political debacle in Afghanistan. I think what it came down to was moral weakness at the end of the day. There was a big purge, as you were, I think during Obama's era about 10 years ago. And I think the message was clear, and that anybody who speaks their mind isn't going to last long in the military. And somewhere along the way, and I couldn't put my finger on it, and this is also part of, a larger argument you could make. And I went to West Point, the guys who I went to West Point with, I think most folks in ROTC and other things in terms of the officer corps, I think most folks generally begin with an ethical compass. So where do you go then to the four-star general who's blatantly lying? And then as soon as he or she gets out, they get paid millions of bucks, like the Secretary of Defense, to work for Raytheon, and then he's right back in there. And now we have a war in the Ukraine when you start to connect all the dots there. And there's definitely some immorality in that. And so where do you go from a lieutenant to a four-star general and then beyond when they get out in terms of the morals? And I think just somewhere along the way, folks choose obedience over doing the right thing for the military, for the mission, for their men and women under their command, but most importantly for the country. Because two things happen if you're disobedient. One, you get fired, and there were very few generals over there of any rank who actually spoke up, and anyone who did was fired. And I think one of the most vocal ones, as you remember, is Kurt Schiller. He was very, very decorated Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel who is justifiably upset at the fall of Afghanistan, that he was actually arrested for actually speaking out. There were a few generals in Afghanistan who spoke out. So the message is clear. If you want higher rank, you have to be obedient. And how do you be obedient? You don't be the guy who goes in there 10 years into the war and say, this is an unwinnable war. No one's going to do that. The other thing is the old boys club. There was a research that was done back in 2013, and then there was one published earlier this year too, and the numbers haven't changed. Somewhere at a 60 to 80% of the senior generals all across the board in all the branches, when they get out, they become CEOs, board members of military defense corporations. This goes back to Eisenhower. And so if you're the guy who goes over there and you say it's an unwinnable war, the big defense contractors who are making all the money from this war are not going to hire you because it's bad for the business. And so at the end of the day, this is where it comes back to. I think it's moral weakness. It's not I'm a political, but I think it's folks who want rank, and they also don't want to get rid of the golden ring at the end of the day with a job afterwards. And at some point, you have to compromise your ideals for this thing to happen, because even as early as 2007 in Afghanistan, the outcome, in my view, I spent all my tours over there on the Helmand, and the bloodiest place in the country. The outcome was inevitable even back then, and that was 14 years before the whole country collapsed.
Right. We're gonna end our military piece on Iraq and Afghanistan, the differences, because that's going to be a important piece, but a little complicated. But before you get to that, you talked about some of these things, so I kind of mentioned them, but alluded to them. But specifically, you listed thing I talked about misguiding, misleading the public. But you talk about you list out at bullet points things that they said that were the opposite of truth. It seems that they did not want to admit that there was a sectarian violence. They were saying that the Iraqis were ready to take control, and they weren't. There were a lack of training and manpower, where the tax dollars went, and that whether or not they had a plan to win. So talk about some of these things, that you noticed that were counter to what was being said and that were really problematic to the men and women who were there fighting.
I think one of the most problematic points over there happened in about 2013. And in the book, I have about 4 pages of just a rant where I just kept a diary in no particular order of what actually happened over there. Because this is when the whole blue on green violence was beginning to take shape, and a lot of the corruption was being known over there.
Mhm.
They had an organization over there called SIGAR, and it was a special investigator for the corruption and the misuse of funds in Afghanistan. And it was supposed to be an independent body, and they had one similar in Iraq as well. And so they were supposed to be kind of like the inspector general, saying what was actually going on over there, to account for the taxpayers' hard-earned bucks, and then the outcome that we had over there. And I would read over there on the Stars and Stripes how they would make some very blatant claims of the corruption going on over there. And then there was the commentary that like this would never see the light of day, how the generals were just sweeping it under, and then ultimately this organization was closed down. And so it's like you have the guys who are spending all the money, and but then they of course don't want anybody to show the world how much money is being wasted over there. And what one of the best examples I saw over there was this Marine Corps headquarters that was built, cost about 40 million of your taxpayers' bucks. And so I put that into perspective. How many thousands of homes in your neighborhood does it take for the taxes to be collected for 40 million bucks? So if you get that many thousands of folks in your neighborhood, they pull all their hard-earned money after spending countless hours paying taxes and stuff, to
Right.
build a building in the middle of Afghanistan. So the first half of the tour, the contractors were working super hard on this thing, and then they tore the thing down and said it wasn't necessary. So as a taxpayer, you're like, dude, so I wasted all that time with the IRS and my 1040 that I have to turn in every April, just to have the money just bulldozed and then just thrown into a trash heap in Afghanistan. Where was the accountability and the outrage for it? I mean, there were many, 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 many countless examples like I had over there.
Right, right. You even talked about there being equipment problems too, right? Well, you had to damage equipment to make it functional because somebody had the idea of giving you equipment that wouldn't work for um, the task at hand, so to speak. I remember at least two situations where you had to augment one, and then you had to fight with a superior to change the request for another piece of equipment.
Yeah, I think that was a function of when you had this war and you had all this money to be made and profiteering to be made. And it wasn't necessarily all bad. One of the good things was in the war, especially in the medical field, is a lot of advancements are made during war because there's money to do the research. But the issue is you still need a watchdog to look at all the money, because you have all the small contractors, big contractors there who see all this money, and then they throw a gazillion ideas at you because it has the U.S. Army stamped on it doesn't necessarily mean it's approved that it's actually going to work. One of the things over there was we had litters, and so those are this stretchers made out of nylon and a plastic and metal. When our troops get wounded, you strap a soldier to it, and then you stick them on a vehicle to get them out of the ambush zone. But these things wouldn't fit inside the vehicles because of the armor that was placed on there. And so I think it was apparent that the folks who designed it weren't speaking to the guys who were actually building the vehicles to make sure this thing fit. And it was a quick fix to it, but the quick fix mean that we had to cut a lot of the handles off of it. And it, of course, muffled some feathers there, and I think we ruined like $1 million worth of litters. But it was the right thing. Otherwise, our troops wouldn't fit inside the vehicles in an ambush zone.
Hey, I see Will's here. Hey, Will, before I move on to the coming home part, do you want to ask or mention anything um, of interest about the book about Iraq, Afghanistan, or anything that we've been talking about up until now?
I think I'll just get into the flow of the conversation. I
No
don't
problem.
know what you guys have covered so far. Jana, good to electronically meet you. Charles, good to
Great to
see
meet you
you.
too.
Sorry to be late. Our computers are out for some damn reason, so I just drove home.
You have to go
Basically,
home, right? I see.
yeah. Well,
Um,
this is the house in the background. This is where the magic happens.
that's
Yeah. So
it's
I mean,
so
it's an old cliche. I guess, this is the living room. It's not really it's where the dinners happen. Yeah.
yeah. Well, so I guess I'll come back to what that's going to mean for the military in as far as after years of misleading the public and morale down, and then what happens with new recruits going forward, what that's going to do for the military. But then you go through all this and you finish your tours and you decide to leave, like you say, without retirement because it was so bad. And then the third part of the book being coming home to war is what you came home to. So talk about, what you saw from a cultural change and what you saw happening in medicine, obviously with COVID and other things that made you think it was important to speak out.
What I saw when I came back was, um, I mean, throughout American history, everybody has their own political ideals. And for most of my career in medicine and in the military, somebody may go into to the poll and they'll pull the blue handle or the red handle, but when they're not in the polling booth and they're back at their job, they're Americans. And so in the military, politics had no place, and in medicine too. It didn't matter who you voted for or what your political perspectives were, but you spoke as colleagues, and you spoke with science and research as being the most powerful thing, not a political ideology. And what I was seeing over time was that was changing, where people were allowing, or the organizations were allowing, the dominant political ideologies to begin to guide medicine and science. And this was an issue because I was also noticing over time that certain political parties were achieving power within a lot of the medical organizations, and they were beginning to flex their power when COVID hit. And this is also, and it wasn't just medicine, as you saw, where you had a lot of censorship going on. It was happening in the corporate world and everything else, but it just seemed to be a free for all where they were using their might to impose their will on medicine itself. And it got so bad when I would go home, that I used to quip that the scientific method ended when COVID hit, because you had the rise of the drug corporations who were making record profits. We were getting told as the physicians, the cheaper off the shelf things where the drug corporations weren't making any money. We were not to experiment or to use those or anything. We were just supposed to wait, hold firm, until the big expensive vaccines and the big expensive drugs came out. And that was a huge issue in my mind.
Anything on the
Yeah.
COVID piece, Will?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple comments there. I mean, I do have a broad question about what you think, John, the handling process for COVID should have been. But I mean, the last point there is hard to ignore. I mean, so you pretty openly think that there was a financial incentive behind the kind of the rejection in mainstream medicine of sort of any care that didn't involve vaccines or expensive pharma. I mean, is that correct?
Yeah. One of the things I noticed was, I mean, I kind of spelled it out a little bit in the timelines, but when COVID first hit, for the first about 3 or 4 months, science was doing what it was supposed to be doing. There was a lot of dialogue. When you have something new and you haven't seen it before, it's based upon experience, which is how most things in medicine go. If you have something new, somebody will say, "Hey, we have a new disease. We have a new thing, whatever it is. We don't have a known treatment for it yet, but hey, I tried this medication. It seems to work. This one that doesn't seem to work." And then from there, folks will do the research on the actual drugs, and then you see which one actually works. It does take a long time, admittedly, to get those things done. But after about April of 2020, though, that was no longer the case, and there were some very draconian edicts coming down, and it was not evidence based whatsoever. What they were saying, they had very little to back up what they were saying of what to use and what not to use. They were just saying, "Trust us, because this may cause harm." And I tried to stress in the book, I was not for or against anything. I'm not an ever, I think I gave 5 ivermectin scripts in the whole time. I was not for or against Paxlovid. I was not for or against certain things, but I wanted to see how things worked, one from an experience level, but I also wanted to see the research and the data. And I saw a lot of the data coming out initially where they were suppressing the research in certain areas, but they didn't have the research for it. For example, dexamethasone. Dexamethasone was, we were told not to use it. It's a steroid as an outpatient, and there was absolutely no evidence for it. They had evidence for it as inpatient, but then from the same trial, they said, don't use it as an outpatient. And so I was kind of afraid at first. I didn't want to make folks worse. And then a bunch of us began to use it in small doses on outpatients and stuff. And then we definitely saw some like benefit. Now, am I saying that dexamethasone was the cure for it? Absolutely not. But the way a medicine works is if you have something new, you have one doctor tries it, and then you have another doctor tries it too, and you have a bunch of case reports saying, hey, this thing is safe, it doesn't work, or it's actually causing harm. And the ones who actually pass the muster, then you begin to do some research on the trials until you get to the gold standard in research, where you have a randomized controlled trial. And one of the big things was, for example, of ivermectin. I'm not a proponent of it. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's bad. But I found it interesting that they said that it was dangerous to use, and they said folks were going to overdose on it. And I would constantly check every month for that patient who was going to die of an ivermectin overdose. And there were 2 who died in New Mexico early on, but they already had horrible COVID anyway, and so it was very hard to pin on them. And there were absolutely no other deaths. And then way back at the end of 2022, then they decided to do the big ivermectin trial, which was of course way too late, and you couldn't have used Tic Tacs at that point to say, hey, this was going to work or not. I mean, even now I live in Bear County, Texas. I'm a population 2 million folks, and yes, there's still COVID here, but nobody's died in the last 2 months because the mortality of it just went down, down, down. And so the question is, why was ivermectin suppressed initially? I don't know. Again, I'm not for it. I'm not against it, but it was just one of many drugs and treatments, things like ibuprofen and other things too. We were told, oh, it's going to make patients bad, but they again had no evidence to support that. And then in the background, we saw Paxlovid, where Pfizer made billions and billions when that thing first came out. And then they had some other inpatient drugs that they said, hey, these things work. I'm going to have the infamous one, the remdesivir. That was the one where even the Wall Street or was it the Washington Post called out Dr. Fauci when he changed his mind on the outcome measure for the research early on, which is a no-no. And then as soon as he approved it, the company who made it netted about 3 or 4 billion for a drug that even last year the WHO said it doesn't work. And so you have to ask yourself, why at the big national level were these things being done for drugs that were proven not to work? And it was only done in the instances in my mind where you had a lot of money.
One of the things that was really notable to me about COVID was that there seemed to be almost a hostility to things that seemed very obviously likely to help with the disease. And that kind of ranges across the board. I mean, so for example, one of the biggest contributing factors to COVID death under 60 is, you know better than me, Doc, is just being out of shape.
Wait.
There was a virtual refusal to discuss any sort of fitness aspect to this. There was a virtually universal reluctance to discuss, for example, basic things, vitamin D. I mean, there was little, if any, discussion of the actual risk target population, which would essentially be seniors. Seniors were not ever, there was no proposal that they, for example, be quarantined, everyone else live their life. We had, I don't mean to go on like a ramble about this, but we had months of discussion from, senior figures in the government about how N95 masks wouldn't do much. We now know those are the only masks that work. And I mean, I guess there's not necessarily a single through line question here, but all of this seemed entirely erratic. And I mean, prior to the release of the vaccines, also sort of illogical. I mean, so you think part of that was a preference for non-vaccine pharma products, or what was there any coherent strategy going on at all? Because it seems like very early on, a lot of quants online, including me, like identified the population that was at risk, some simple things you could do to greatly reduce your risk. And there was virtually no discussion of those. That's in your mind because of the preference for pharma alternatives or just incoherent bad leadership?
Well, it's hard to say. I think that is molecular combination of the two. And you bring up a fantastic point, because that was something that was always on my mind too. I couldn't include everything in the book, but yeah,
Of
four
course,
more risk factors is where most folks died. And what were some of the first things that they did? They closed down churches, they closed down gyms, and so you had depression rates spike. More kids died of drugs and anxiety, society issues, and psychiatric issues than ever died from a COVID, from COVID itself. And I thought it was actually criminal now that they're talking about how the psychiatric issues skyrocketed in adolescence and stuff, and it was the age group who wasn't at risk in the first place. I mean,
and this was all.
even at its peak, the risk of a child dying of COVID was between house fires and a heart attack at
Yeah.
its peak.
And this was all extremely predictable. I mean, we're kind of just batting the ball back and forth, like, yeah, that was dumb. But I mean, at a certain level, obviously, if you shut down most or all of society to prevent a 10% increase in the death rate, perhaps concentrated among people with at least pre-vaccine an average age of 81, there's going to be a massive downside effect to that. So, I mean, we actually saw the national IQ score drop. I mean, suicides, overdoses are combined at 150,000 per year. That skyrocketed dramatically under COVID-19. So all of this was, to a certain extent, extremely predictable. And many people said that this was going to happen as all of this was going on. We're going to see extraordinary depression among youth. We're going to see people lose 2 years worth of schooling. And we went ahead and did it. And the question for me would just be the motivation behind that. What is it? And I think that's still kind of a Gordian knot. I'm not sure I know at this point. It just can't happen again would be, my take from that.
But how does it not happen again? They didn't learn anything.
Well,
I'm still watching vaccination commercials right now.
let's just go the fuck outside. I mean, like, I don't mean to be crude, but like in the urban areas of a red state, like Louisville and Cincinnati aren't Chicago or New York, but they're cities of 2 million people. People just return to living their lives pretty rapidly. I mean, I recall that I was one of a group of men who in my neighborhood shopped for older people, especially older women, because it was obvious those were the people that were dying of COVID. So I think that there's that policy approach where whatever the rule might be, I mean, people might mask up in a concentrated public place, you're polite, but continue existing because life ends in death and the average life expectancy is much less than 81. Or you can go with what Chicago was doing until really the start of this year, where the students in the prep schools were eating outside. We both discussed this. I mean, multiple shots required to go to campus. I think that citizens are going to vote with their own behavior the next time this happens. But I do hope a competent leader at the top of things won't attempt to mandate what we saw last time.
But John, we have another problem. I mean, I know most of the book as you're a doctor, so you spent a lot of the time talking about medicine and the problems we just highlighted as far as COVID is concerned. But I think about it because you say coming home to war and talking about what you're seeing from a cultural standpoint. One, whether we learn something from that or not, we may, like Will says, something like that happens again. Some people may not go for it and they may speak up faster, but the leadership hasn't really changed. And the same for the military. So I wanted to go back to that in the sense that we have other cultural problems from you do talk in the book about suppressing facts and misleading people, controlling social media, suppressing free speech and things of that nature. But then there's the cultural thing where the people in power get to dictate, they change in words and what the meaning of words and weaponizing it and saying what you can and can't say. It's violence on you if you say you don't like certain groups of people. And then you were very non-political, and typically I am, but we got to say he is the guy who said it. Biden got into office and days in got behind a podium and boasted about how he was going to make race important in every administration, part of the decision that every section of his administration looks at. So you talk about what the generals were doing, and I said I wanted to go back to that. So you got the military, you got a certain type who just won't go to the military anyway. And those who would normally go, just like the police officers across the country, you're getting lower enrollment, you got fewer people willing to go, willing to do the job. And now we have, to elevate to the top brass, whatever man is identifying as a woman, you get a fast track, right? And race, and I know you talk about before um, him coming into the Biden administration, but you talk about the Secretary of Defense and kind of his decisions prior to that. So what kind of toll do you think this is going to take on the country writ large, but also on the military?
One of the things that I tried to highlight to connect the dots on both of those was I think at this point in both of the empires, to get back to the medical side and to the military side, I think right now a lot of the faults that we're discussing here and that I spent the whole book discussing are not going to be fixed from within the organizations. They're going to have to come from without, which means a political solutions to these issues, but the political solutions won't come from the politicians in play because they're the ones who enabled it in the first place. It's going to come from the grassroots level, and it's going to come from the American people. It's like in the military piece of it, and I hope I didn't offend folks, but I also meant it that way to be as well. I have a lot of very graphic pictures in there of what war is about, and I included that for several reasons. One, as a physician, and as a medical type over in the war, I had a very visceral response to how the war was supposed to be going, how it was actually going, and yet the blood was still getting spilled and the bodies were still there. There's a saying, you can't hide the bodies, right? You can say there's no crime in the city, but when I'm in an ER and I'm seeing gunshot wounds every day, somebody's lying, right?
Mhm.
And so this is something too where there's actually consequences. So you have generals and the politicians who are misleading the American people, but how many generals ended up in the body bags? Very few. It was the sons and daughters, the fathers, the mothers of the American people who paid the ultimate price. 2,448 deaths in Afghanistan before the Abbey Gate bombing. And what did we have to show for it? Absolutely nothing. Is the military speaking about it? I went to West Point a few months ago, and they were doing this big a conference for how they're going to inject DEI to fix the military, whatever it is. And one, that wasn't the reason why we lost in Afghanistan, but there was no discussion whatsoever, and the military is not doing much introspection either. So it's like 2,448 headstones are there in cemeteries all around the United States, and it's like the military doesn't give a darn. The soldiers do, but the leadership, I mean, how many of them stood up and protested and said back in 12, 13, 2014, 2015, and they said, this isn't working and I'm not going to work another day and plant another American in the ground. How many of them had that courage and conviction? None. And so when you have it so ingrained in the culture now, again, the way to success to get an additional rank on your collar and to get the big the military industrial jobs where you're going to get paid a lot, you have to be obedient. And so I think it's pointless to try and fix it from within. And as a West Pointer, where a lot of these guys came from, they're actually West Point grads. The fact that West Point, where the honor part is so important to us, or at least to a lot of us at least, it creates an issue. So I think the ultimate fix is going to have to come from the American people who have just had enough, and they say no more until the wars, no more of this stuff comes down. When the next pandemic comes down, science needs to prevail, not money, not politics, not the stuff, but we need science. And if the government can't prove why they're saying not to use something or to use something in particular, they shouldn't be allowed to do it. Only science in the medical field should be able to do that.
Will, what do you think about that? I think that he's unfortunately right, but how does that happen? I mean, if we can't, like I always say, legislate it out. We can't just, go to the polls and click a button and solve it that way. And obviously, leadership is not going to change because they're still going to get the cushy jobs when they leave, and they're still going to, want the power, and they're still going to push the DEI, and they're still going to, they've already captured the universities. Now they're working on the military, the AMA, all of the medical organizations. So, but if he's saying that it's up to us as citizens to do it, but how does that look in reality?
I mean, if you're asking me and I'd be interested in John's take on this too, but if you're asking me as a political scientist and sometime leader, I would say that citizens and their leaders have to make rules to make it happen. I mean, so the idea, once you're dealing with institutional corruption, it's very, very hard to root out institutional corruption from within an institution. I was just reading an interesting article about how the government of Indonesia actually knew that its police forces and its customs guys were so corrupt that there was no way to internally fix that. So they hired a Swiss company to revamp the whole system. They gave them complete power, and they were literally throwing guys out on their ass. They were firing people that had been in there for 30 years. I mean, they closed a port for a couple of weeks. And in the end, they finally got everything whipped into line, but it took years. And it took the power of this external actor that had that ability to replace the troubled leaders for a period of time. I mean, so what would that look like in America? I mean, I don't necessarily, well, actually, I think it'd be the same thing even in the case of the military. But for example, I mean, Ron DeSantis, like him or not, is a pretty effective leader. So, I mean, one thing he's done is just pass rules that say, well, it's illegal, at least until the courts tell me it's not, to have certain programs that I define as racist in place in any institution. So, how do you get the DEI department out of colleges? I mean, you elect people that say we can't tolerate this. It's just reverse racism, which is just simply racism, and we're gonna ban it. I mean, like, I don't see any reason not to say this, but like, I recently had a conversation with New College in Florida. Like, they seem to be hiring an entirely new faculty. That's the college where Chris Rufo's on the board of trustees.
Right.
So, how do you get, I mean, you find some kind of malfeasance, you close contracts, and you hire new people, I guess. I mean, the thing with the military, actually, the two things John's talking about, the military and medicine, are really troubling. Because like even in the business world, sitting in like sales and trading floor environments, which I mean, I also thought would be pretty sacrosanct. But the idea was all this HR bullshit. Like there are places where it's never going to reach. You can't, I mean, guys would say you can't do that in the army. You know, you can't have, you're not going to have rainbow flags on the warships and all that. I mean, and it seems like that actually is happening to some extent. Again, similarly, surgical medicine, I think, was an environment where people thought, no, I mean, hiring is going to have to be purely merit based simply because so many people could be injured or killed if it's not. I mean, I can't think of any equivalent except maybe airline pilots. But again, we see those issues. So I think how you fix it is you elect people that pass rules that bring with them mandatory fixes. I mean, you can't be a doctor unless you pass such and such a set of boards. But as a question for John, when you talk about the military, how prevalent is what we sometimes call wokeness in the US military? Is that genuinely something you see? And I guess as a part two, is that a bigger problem than more structural issues like yes man culture or a desire to be a lobbyist for Raytheon? Like how do those things stack up?
Um, I have to be careful kind of in my lane. I've
Sure.
been out of the military for about 9 years or so. I did though get a good glimpse of the DoD and actually NASA and a few other federal organizations. I went to this West Point DEI conference at the end of August this past year, and
Oh,
so it was a 2 day conference. It was me and another West Point grad who had concerns like you, and so we basically bit our tongue until the very last day when they had a question and answer session up there. But we made a few comments about it. One, it was like a massive echo chamber. They had Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. They had
mhm.
NASA guys there, and they were all saying the same thing over and over again. And there were a few interesting points. For example, number one of my West Point classmates is the head data guy at West Point, and he even said because the question was, show us the data to justify all the DEI, and he said, I can't do it. There's no data there, and there's not. The whole thing is based upon just hearsay. It's a circular argument because if you get more folks from different backgrounds, it just wins you win, but there's no evidence to show any of how that actually goes to show that that's more important than an organization like the military, where meritocracy has also been the most important thing. And I thought that was kind of an interesting piece too. It was the echo chamber. Like we were kind of we got a lot of evil eyes when we spoke during the breaks over there because you had 400 folks in the room and they were all beating the same drum. They were actually trying to create this false history. And with a straight face, you had at West Point, where you had professors who had been there for years, with a straight face, they were saying that only heterogeneous militaries have prevailed in the history of warfare in the world. Exactly. And I spoke to the head of the AOG, to the dean up there, and I'm like, do you guys really believe this? Um, and of course, they would like tap dance around the issue, but they're justifying what's going on with the false history. That of course is not true. I mean, look at Afghanistan. We were bested by guys on a shoestring budget who were not only Islamic, but they were from the same sect. All Pashtuns or from the same sect of Islam over there, the same skin color over there, not different ethnicities and stuff, and they bested us. It was one of the most homogeneous militaries in history. And to stick an exclamation point, what did the Taliban do when they won? They did massive ethnic cleansing, and I kind of touched on that. The Hazaris and a lot of other ones. Vietnam, the same thing. The North Vietnamese military was one of the most homogeneous militaries in the history of the world. And when they were done, what did they do? They beat up on the Montagnards and a lot of other folks who were the ethnic minorities of there. Just to put an exclamation point that their ethnicity won the war. So to sort of put out such falsehood and then have everybody around the room say, yeah, this is what it is. Again, it goes back to the moral weakness. Where were the history professors up there who were supposed to be pushing honor academics? It's an academic institution. It's called an academy for a reason up there, because it's supposed to be where you can debate and have schools of thought. But the thing is, there is no debate. There's no school of thought. If you disagree, you're showing the door.
Yeah, just as a very quick comment there, I mean, there have obviously been very effective heterogeneous militaries. I mean, Britain during the imperial period, the USA, so on down the line. But my understanding was that most of the best sort of fighting men in the world came from homogenous areas and backgrounds. The Japanese, the Gurkhas. I mean, evil, but they fought us quite well. The Nazis. I mean, going back through pre-Subutai Mongols, like I've never heard anyone make that claim, actually, which makes it kind of interesting. I mean, there
It was a
weren't many.
repeated it was a repeated theme that they were making there, and I want to be very, very clear. I'm not an Aryan or anything like that, and I'm not saying that only one group wins. It just so happens that through American history, most of our militaries were actually white in World War I and World War II. I deployed to Afghanistan with a Hispanic special forces group. I was actually almost in the minority over there, but that's just because it was the meritocracy of the group and the way I believe it, just according to John Hughes in my world, just like in medicine and any other specialty too. I think you include everybody who wants to participate in it, kind of like the NBA is a great example in sports, right? The NBA, they actually made the claim that the NBA is a very heterogeneous organization. And I'm like, do you guys really believe that? I should call that the professor on that, right? Because you have most of the coaches are white, most of the players are African American there. Why is that? Because through a meritocracy at this point in this year, in the year 2023, in the corporate world, those are the ones who are the best ones on their teams that they want to have. Same thing in the military. If you're going out in front of the Navy SEALs, it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. If you're the best guy, then you get picked to be on SEAL Team 6, regardless of how tall you are, how short you are, what your ethnic background is. It's a strictly meritocracy thing. But when you start to, with a straight face, say that we have to have racial quotas here, there, whatever, because it's been proven throughout history to be better, it's a fallacy. And the data person, again, even up there, even said he couldn't pull up a single algorithm to say that there's been any research at all on showing that that it actually works. So again, it's just groupthink, but it just gets back to it. The same reason why Afghanistan happened, in my opinion, is its moral weakness. There's a toxic ideology there, and you don't get promoted in today's military by opposing the political views being thrust on the military. If you speak up, you're out. And if you speak up, Raytheon's not going to hire you with the $1 million bucks a year job either.
And I just want to say, as bad as that point you made was, it's even worse than that, because when they talked about the military would be stronger with this higher level of diversity, and you say there's no data there, which is true, they don't mean anymore just race. So I get some more blacks and Hispanics here along with these white guys. We could do this. They mean race, gender, religion, gender identity, everything, right? So they're like, it's not just, let everybody compete. It's regardless of meritocracy, we need them there. So if they're not the best, then we swap out some people to put a couple trans and a couple women and a couple Muslims and a couple, all these other groups. So it's not even just skin color. It's all the melting pot makes it better. And it doesn't matter, what their skill level is, which is a big problem. How about you finish up by telling us telling the people what you want to leave them with in the book?
Well, the biggest thing I want to leave folks with is that the only way change, as we said, is going to happen is from the grassroots up. And so from the military side, if you want to see more lost wars, we haven't won a major war since the end of World War II. We will continue to lose wars until we have generals who are honest and can win. What in past wars, if generals couldn't, they were given 1, 2, 3 months to win, and if they couldn't, they got them fired. And that's just like in the corporate world. If you lead a Fortune 500 corporation and you have 2 losing quarters in a row, you're out. If you're an NFL coach and you have so many losing seasons, you're out. It isn't personal; it's business. And in the military and in medicine, it isn't just business; it's the security of the nation and the health of the nation. And so when you have folks who are being led by things other than a patriotism or science, perhaps in the medical side of it, or from the military side, what's best for the country and for the military itself. If they're being led by other things like a desire for an extra star or a desire for a cushy job outside of it, then they have no business being in the military. Throughout the entire war, they should have been given a few months and just fired. I mean, they should have gone through 100 times as many generals, and then at some point, some general would have said, "Whoa, stop firing us because the war is unwinnable." And if that had been said, then the monkey's back on the politicians, and then the generals couldn't have been with a straight face said, "We did everything that we could by standing up on it." And in the medical piece of it, we have to be sure that more pandemics are going to come, more health scares are going to happen, but we have to absolutely make sure that science leads the way, and science open-ended from all political spectrums. We can't have social media dictating what medicines we're supposed to use, what doctors are allowed to say, who gets blocked off social media because the doctor says something unpopular. This can never happen again, and we need ethical transparency. When you have guys like Rand Paul asking repeatedly, guys like Dr. Fauci, how much did the vaccine boards get from Pfizer, and he refuses to say, that's a problem. They should have all been fired at that point, every one of them, because it's easy to say. If you didn't make any money, just say it. But obviously, there's so much shadow of a doubt, and there's so much of a corruptive influence of money in both of the professions. So you need to separate money from the ethics of the profession.
And it sounds like you're talking about, it all boils down to accountability, kind of like you were giving examples of people being terminated, coaches if they don't do the job, if they lose a certain games, or maybe a president of an elite university who loses $100 million donation. They got to go too. He is John Hughes, author of American Doctor, Coming Home to War. John, thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you very much.
From you commies who lame, no, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.